What if I told you African countries once boycotted the World Cup and that this boycott is part of the reason African countries are able to qualify for and even play in the 2026 World Cup today? Now, if you're not a football fan and you're like me and you only watch soccer when the World Cup or AFCON is on, you might be wondering, why would African countries boycott the World Cup in the first place? See, I had the same question myself after coming across an Al Jazeera article titled World Cup 1966, Africa's Boycott, Pele's Injury, England's trophy. And that's when I learned that in 1966, almost the entire continent of Africa boycotted the tournament. And the reason? It was a political issue about whether African countries were going to accept a system they believed was fundamentally unfair. More specifically, African nations were being asked to compete for a World Cup place under rules that many believed treated an entire continent differently from the rest of the world. So in many ways, the story we're talking about today is bigger than football. It's a story about how newly independent African nations understood their place in the world and what they were willing to do when they felt they weren't being treated as equals. Welcome back to They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numa, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. Look, I'm not saying Africa is the next Bitcoin. What I am saying, though, is that every generation has something people overlook until it's impossible to ignore. You have the internet, social media, smartphones, AI. Meanwhile, Africa is home to the world's youngest population right now, some of the fastest growing economies on the planet, and a workforce that will help shape the global economy for decades to come. Yet, many of us in the diaspora know surprisingly little about the continent beyond headline stereotypes and whatever we happen to learn from our families. That's why I started this podcast, because you cannot build with, invest in, or benefit from a place that you do not understand. And if Africa is going to be part of your future, it should probably start to be part of your education too. So let's learn together. Today we're talking about the 1966 World Cup boycott, a story that starts decades before the 2026 World Cup, but helps explain why Africa has multiple teams competing on football's biggest stage today. Because when you're watching Senegal, Morocco, Ghana, Egypt, or any other African team compete against the world's best, you're seeing the result of a fight that started long before many of those players or even some of those countries were born. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand why some of the African teams playing in this year's World Cup owe part of their place there to a protest that happened 60 years ago. So let's get into it. So to understand why African countries boycotted the 1966 World Cup, we need to understand the moment they were living in. So by 1966, countries across the continent had spent the previous decade gaining independence from colonial rule. Ghana became independent in 1957, Guinea in 1958, Nigeria and Senegal in 1960, and Algeria in 1962 after a brutal war against France. Now, as great as it sounds that many African countries were finally becoming independent and free from colonial rule, independence didn't magically solve everything overnight. In fact, in many ways, the hardest part was just beginning. See, think about it. For generations, colonial powers had made the major political and economic decisions. They determined what resources would be extracted, where infrastructure was built, what industries would be prioritized, and who could hold power. Now, those countries had to figure it out for themselves. Governments had to be established and strengthened because many of these nations were now responsible for managing territories and populations on their own. Economies had to be rebuilt because colonial economies were often designed to serve Europe, not the people living there. A country might export cocoa, peanuts, or minerals, but that doesn't automatically mean it has the industries, institutions, or infrastructure needed to create long-term prosperity. Take Ghana, actually, for an example. Independence gave the country political control over its future, but leaders still had to decide what the future should look like, how the economy should be structured, what industries should receive investment, and how the country should position itself internationally. The same questions were basically being asked across the entire continent. In Senegal, leaders were trying to figure out how to build an economy that wasn't dependent on decisions being made in Paris. In Nigeria, the government was trying to manage a large and incredibly diverse country while also deciding how to use its resources for development. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was pushing ambitious development projects and promoting the idea that Africa's future depended on cooperation between African nations. And these conversations weren't only happening inside government buildings. They were basically happening everywhere because for the first time in a long time, those decisions were being made by Africans themselves. And as more African countries gained independence, another idea started gaining momentum. The belief that while each country was independent, many of the challenges they faced were shared, which is why leaders across the continent began meeting with one another more frequently, coordinating politically, and supporting liberation movements and looking for more ways to amplify Africa's voice on the international stage. In 1963, that effort led to the creation of the Organization of Africa Unity, or the OAU, which brought together independent African states under a common institution. The goal was not to create one giant African country or anything like that. The goal was cooperation. African leaders wanted a place where they could coordinate with one another, support countries that were still fighting for independence, discuss common challenges, and present a stronger voice internationally. And while African leaders disagreed on plenty of things, the creation of the OAU reflected something important. There was growing recognition that some problems were bigger than any one country. Some challenges require collective action. Now, that doesn't mean every African country agreed on everything. They didn't. But there was growing recognition that if African countries wanted to be taken seriously internationally, there were moments when acting together would be far more effective than acting alone. And before long, one of those moments would arrive in a place most people wouldn't expect: the World Cup. So, what exactly happened? Why were African countries willing to boycott the biggest football tournament in the world? Well, it starts with how qualification for the 1966 World Cup worked. So today, right, if a country wants to make it to the World Cup, it competes against other countries in its region for a certain number of spots. Africa has its qualification processes. Europe has its own, and South America has its own. And while people still argue about whether their region deserves more places, every region at least knows how many teams can qualify. But that wasn't the case in 1966. See, at the time, FIFA had 16 places available in the World Cup. England automatically qualified as the host nation. Brazil also automatically qualified as the defending champions, and most of the remaining places went to Europe and South America. Africa, however, wasn't guaranteed a single place in the tournament. Why? Well, according to FIFA, African football simply hadn't proven itself yet. At the time, no sub-Saharan African team ever played in a World Cup finals tournament, and many officials within FIFA believed the strongest football was still concentrated in Europe and South America. So rather than guaranteeing Africa its own place, FIFA grouped African countries together with countries from Asia and Oceania and made them compete for a shared spot. In other words, FIFA's position was essentially, if Africa wants a guaranteed place at the World Cup, it first needs to prove it deserves one. Now, that may not sound like a huge deal at first, but after all, one spot is still one spot. But here's where I think things get interesting. That one spot wasn't even guaranteed to go to an African country. In fact, even if an African team successfully made it through African qualification, they would still have to face a team from another region in a final playoff to earn a place at the World Cup, which meant there was a very real possibility that an entire continent could go through qualification and still end up with no representative at the tournament. And that's exactly what many African football officials had a problem with, because from their perspective, this wasn't simply about football. It was about how Africa was being treated and compared to everybody else. Europe had guaranteed places. South America had guaranteed places. Africa did not. And remember the context. We're talking about a period when African countries had only recently gained independence. These were governments, institutions, and leaders that were increasingly questioning unequal systems they believed placed Africa at a disadvantage. So when African football officials looked at FIFA's qualification structure, many of them saw the same pattern they believed they were confronting elsewhere. African participation was welcome. African equality was not. Now, to be fair, FIFA had its own argument. Their position was basically, prove that African teams can compete at the highest level first, and then we'll talk about giving Africa a guaranteed place. But African countries rejected that logic, because how do you prove yourself on the world's biggest stage if you're not even being given the same opportunity to reach it as everybody else? It's like applying for a job that requires experience while nobody's willing to give you the opportunity to gain that experience in the first place. The more African football leaders discussed the issue, the more frustrated they became. And this wasn't just one country complaining or two countries. This was becoming a continent-wide issue. Football officials across Africa increasingly agreed that the problem wasn't whether one country could qualify. The problem was that an entire continent was being denied the same level of representation that other regions already enjoyed. And once African countries reached that conclusion, the conversation started to change. The question was no longer how do we qualify, it became, why are we accepting these rules in the first place? Now, African countries didn't immediately decide to boycott the World Cup. In fact, the boycott wasn't the first option. It was one of the last. The first thing African football officials did was try to change the system. At the time, African football was represented by the Confederation of African Football, better known as CAF, and CAF's position was pretty straightforward. If Europe had guaranteed places at the World Cup and South America had guaranteed places at the World Cup, then Africa should have a guaranteed place too. They weren't asking FIFA to hand Africa 4 spots or 5 spots or half the tournament. They were just asking for one guaranteed place. One spot that an African country could earn by competing against other African countries. Nothing more, nothing less. And honestly, from the perspective of many African officials, it seemed like a reasonable request. After all, dozens of African countries were members of FIFA. African football was growing rapidly. Newly independent countries were investing in their national teams. And if the World Cup was supposed to be a global competition, many believed the world's second largest continent deserved guaranteed representation. So, CAF brought its concerns to FIFA, and FIFA said no. The qualification structure for the 1966 World Cup would remain unchanged. Africa could continue competing alongside Asia and Oceania for a shared place. Now, this is where I think the story becomes really interesting, because if this had happened 10 years earlier, African countries might have accepted the decision. But this was not 10 years earlier. This was the 1960s, the same decade in which African countries were gaining independence and in which African leaders were building institutions like the OAU. The same decade in which governments across the continent were becoming increasingly willing to challenge international systems they believed were unfair. So when FIFA rejected their request, many African football officials didn't see it as a sporting disagreement. They saw it as a question of principle. And once it became a question of principle, compromise became much harder, because the issue was no longer how many teams get to play. The question had become, should Africa accept being treated differently from everyone else? And increasingly, the answer coming from across the entire continent was no. And so, after FIFA rejected CAF's request for a guaranteed World Cup place, African football officials were left with a decision to make. Do they accept the rules and continue competing under a system they believe is unfair, or do they refuse to participate altogether? For many African football leaders, the answer became increasingly clear because from their perspective, the issue was no longer about qualifying for a tournament. It was about what participation meant. Think about it. If African countries continue to compete under the existing system, they would essentially be accepting FIFA's position that Africa did not deserve the same level of representation as other regions. And if they accepted that once, what incentive would FIFA have to change anything in the future? The more African officials discussed this issue, the more many of them came to the same conclusion. Participation would legitimize the very system they were trying to change. So, CAF made its move. In 1964, the Confederation of African Football announced that its member nations would withdraw from qualification for the 1966 World Cup unless Africa was granted its own guaranteed place in the tournament. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a real threat, and it carried real consequences. Remember, the World Cup was already the biggest tournament in international football. Players dreamed of competing in it. Countries wanted the prestige that came with appearing on the world's biggest sporting stage. For many nations, participation in the World Cup wasn't just about football. It was about national pride, visibility, and proving that a newly independent country belonged on the world stage. And yet African countries were now willing to walk away from that opportunity, not because they didn't care, obviously, about the World Cup, but because they cared enough to challenge the system governing it. And eventually, country after country backed the boycott. Ghana supported it. Nigeria supported it. Other African nations supported it as well. In total, more than 30 African countries withdrew from the qualification process. Just think about how remarkable that was for a moment. Many of these countries had only recently become independent, and some had been independent for less than a decade, and many were still trying to build stable governments and develop their own economies and establish their place in the international system. They didn't agree on every political issue or have identical histories or priorities, yet on this issue they found common ground. They agreed that Africa deserved better than a qualification system that could leave an entire continent without representation at the World Cup, and there was nothing inevitable about the decision they made. The boycott could have failed. FIFA could have ignored. The tournament could have gone ahead exactly as planned. The world could have just moved on, and African countries could have been left with no World Cup representation and no concessions in return. That was the risk. In fact, that's what made the boycott so powerful, because it required sacrifice. African countries weren't risking something hypothetical. They were risking their opportunity to participate in the biggest football tournament on earth, and they did it anyway. And by the time the qualification for the 1966 World Cup began, African countries had largely followed through on their threat. There would be no African representative at the tournament, no African team competing for the trophy, and no African flag on football's biggest stage. So they were essentially just forcing FIFA to make a decision, and they wanted to see if FIFA was willing to change the system. At first, it didn't look like the boycott had worked. The 1966 World Cup went ahead as planned. The tournament was played in England, and a host of countries competed for the trophy. For the first time in World Cup history, there was not a single African team there. No Ghana, no Nigeria, Senegal, no representative from the continent at all. On the surface, FIFA appeared to have won the standoff. The tournament happened, the matches were played, and a champion was crowned. Life moved on. But underneath the surface, something had changed because the boycott had drawn attention to a question FIFA could no easily ignore. Why was an entire continent excluded from guaranteed representation at the world's biggest football tournament? And remember, this wasn't just pressure coming from one country or one football federation. This was pressure coming across Africa at a time when newly independent nations were becoming more influential internationally. The issue didn't just disappear. If anything, it became harder to justify. So over the next few years, pressure continued to build, and eventually FIFA changed its position. For the 1970 World Cup, Africa would finally receive what it had been asking for all along: a guaranteed place in the tournament. For the first time, an African team no longer had to survive a qualification system that could leave the entire continent unrepresented. For the first time, Africa would have its own direct path to the World Cup, and in 1970, that place was claimed by Morocco. Now, whether FIFA changed its position solely because of the boycott is something historians still debate, but what isn't debated is this, and that is the boycott forced the issue into the spotlight. It made ignoring African concerns far more difficult, and it demonstrated something that African leaders had been learning through the 60s. When African countries acted together, they had far more influence than when they acted alone. And in the end, Africa got the very thing it had been demanding, not because they quietly accepted the system, but because they simply just challenged it. And that's why the boycott is still remembered today, not because Africa missed the 1966 World Cup, but because Africa helped change what came after. So what does any of this have to do with the World Cup we are watching today? Quite a lot, actually, because when African countries boycotted the 1966 World Cup, they weren't fighting for a specific team or generation of players. Many of the people who participated in that boycott would never personally benefit from the changes that followed. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for future generations. And today, 60 years later, those future generations are here. When you watch Senegal qualify for a World Cup, you are seeing part of that legacy. When you watch Morocco make a historic run to the semifinals in 2022, you're seeing part of the legacy. When you see multiple African countries competing on football's biggest stage in 2026, you are seeing part of that legacy too, because none of those moments happen in quite the same way without generations of African officials, players, and leaders who challenged the systems decades earlier. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to tell this story. It's not because it's a football story, but because it's an Africa story. A lot of us in the diaspora grew up hearing about Africa through the lens of problems, poverty, corruption, conflict, underdevelopment. What we hear far less about are the moments when Africans organized, negotiated, pushed back, and successfully changed institutions that were not built with them in mind. The 1966 boycott is one of those moments. And whether you're talking about football, business, politics, investment, or development, the lesson feels surprisingly similar. Individual countries can accomplish a lot on their own, but there are moments when collective action creates outcomes that would be almost impossible to achieve individually. That's one of the lessons African leaders were learning in the 1960s, and it's one of the reasons organizations like the OAU emerged in the first place. Now, I'm not saying every challenge facing Africa today can be solved by everyone simply working together. If it were that easy, we'd have solved them already. Or maybe if we stop these boycott wars. But anyways, I do think there's something powerful about understanding that many of the opportunities available today exist because previous generations were willing to challenge systems they believed were unfair, including in places most people would never think to look, like the World Cup. And maybe that's the bigger takeaway from the story. The next time you are watching an African country walk out on that pitch, remember that you're not just watching 90 minutes of football, you're also watching the results of decisions and sacrifices and collective action that began decades before those players were ever born. And that's a story worth remembering. And that's all I have for you today. That's the story of the 1966 World Cup boycott, a story that started with football, but was never really just about football. It was about representation and fairness, and about what can happen when people decide that participating in a system that isn't enough, they want to help shape it too. One of the things I love most about stories like this is that they remind us how much African history exists outside of the narratives we were usually taught, like I just mentioned. Because honestly, most people know who won the 1966 World Cup. Far fewer know that African countries boycotted it. And even fewer know that the effects of that decision can be still seen in the tournament today, which is exactly why I started this podcast. There are so many stories about Africa that never make it into classrooms, documentaries, or everyday conversations, not because they are important, but because no one thinks to tell them. So hopefully the next time someone asks why African countries have the number of World Cup places they do today, you know the answer. And hopefully you'll also remember that some of the opportunities we enjoy today exist because the people before us were willing the status quo. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if you know someone who loves football, African history, or just learning things they probably should have been taught years ago, send this episode to them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.